I'm Steve Christey Coley with the MITRE Corporation. I'm going to be talking about work with my mentor colleague, Penny Chase, also of the MITRE Corporation. And we want to see consistent and usable security risk assessment for medical devices. And we're just in the beginning stages of this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are approaching the problem. So first of all, though, I want to take a very quick audience poll. How many of you here, just a show of hands, how many of you here are involved in healthcare in one way or another? Okay, cool. How many of you care about CVSS or risk or those kind of things? Okay. And how many of you are horrified by IoT security and that's why you're here? All right, a lot of multiple hands here. How many of you came here for a nap? Okay. I assume everyone who doesn't have their hands raised is already half asleep. And then who here wants me to finish early so they can get all the vendor giveaways? Okay, a couple. All right. So let's get into medical devices. Surprise, surprise, you've all heard medical devices can be insecure. And why is that the case? Just like many other areas of IoT, stuff used to not be computerized, used to not be connected to networks, and now it's starting to happen much more heavily. Greater reliance on computers. These things are being networked together, maybe in separate parts of networks, but they are being networked together on a much more regular basis. Oftentimes, they are built using third-party components and third-party operating systems as well. And unlike classic IT, the medical devices themselves actually are subject to regulation. So that changes a little bit of the risk analysis with respect to that. Also, there are wrinkles within the regulation side of things because it can limit the ability to either patch systems or to reconfigure them or something along those lines. However, there is a very common myth that healthcare providers sometimes hear from healthcare manufacturers about the inability to patch devices because that would force them to go and resubmit to FDA for approval. This is a long-standing myth. It is pretty much a myth. There are only extremely rare cases where simply applying a security or operational patch would force some kind of reevaluation. So there's a lot of confusion out there about those kind of things. You know, with drugs and medicine, there are clinical trials for treatment that can take years, can be very extensive. There's not really such a thing in the case with medical devices. There is a pre-market review and approval, but the clinical trials are really generally very kind of small. And surprise, surprise, a few manufacturers really have integrated security testing into their whole processes. And I'll touch a little bit more on that later. At the MITRE Corporation, we are working with the FDA and supporting them in their vision here, which is a nice piece of buzzwords, I guess, or so. But what the FDA is really trying to do is to build and foster a community-driven approach that brings together lots of different kinds of stakeholders so that community-wide a development of a shared risk assessment framework can be done with the real goal of enhancing patient safety. The idea being to mitigate medical device cybersecurity risk. This is specifically tasking that the FDA has taken on. It's part of their charter, in a sense, when it comes specifically to preserving patient safety. The timing of this has been spurred on also, however, by the discovery of hundreds of vulnerabilities in 2013 by Billy Rios and Terry McCorkle, I think is the other guy, who found, surprise, surprise, a whole bunch of hard-coded passwords in hundreds of devices, and default passwords and so on. And if you think it's the 90s all over again, more or less it is. What part of the FDA's role has been in this whole area has been to provide, and some things that they've done recently is to provide pre-market guidance before manufacturers bring the devices and put them on the market. They go through a review process that, again, is not necessarily extensive, especially with respect to cybersecurity. They have posted clarifications for that, and recently they also posted some post-market guidance for how medical devices should be handled. As part of this whole of community approach that they have taken, they had a workshop in October 2014 that was very well attended, and then another workshop in January of 2016. And at MITRE, we've been supporting them in activities such as those workshops as well. So there's a growing interest not only within industry and the different kind of stakeholders, but the FDA is taking a very active role. But there's a recognition that to solve these problems, we all really need to work together across this diverse ecosystem of many different kinds of stakeholders. The problem that I want to talk to you about today is that when a vulnerability comes out with respect to a medical device, there can be many different interpretations and many different perspectives of what that vulnerability really means. You know, if you're a security researcher, you found a vulnerability, it's a really terrible thing. It can be hyped sometimes, or maybe not, but there's definitely a very the researcher point of view generally is this is very bad, you must fix it, and you must fix it now. Manufacturers have stable development processes. Recall is not necessarily as easy, or replacement is not necessarily as easy as it is for just simple software. And they have to really decide, how bad is this issue? Do I have to, you know, basically make an emergency fix, or could I introduce this into my regular development life cycle? On the healthcare provider side of things, they may well hear about this report through, you know, through media reports with some excessive hype, perhaps. But within their own environment, they may already have developed some number of compensating controls that help to mitigate that particular risk. And with patients, patients generally face a fundamental question, which is, should I even be using this device or not? And the more vulnerabilities get reported, the more that they're hyped, perhaps, the more, if the risk is not appropriately provided and understood, then there's a chance that patients may decide not to use devices. And that's problematic because devices many times are, you know, life-saving or life-altering. And the FDA itself needs to participate in this as well, because at a certain point of severity, at a certain level, the FDA needs to take some kind of action, up to and including potentially a recall. One of the challenges that you face here, especially with respect to the healthcare provider side of things, is that we have three elements that are really factors when it comes to medical devices. There's the classic security and privacy that we know from regular classic IT, but then there's this whole element of safety as well. And depending on which part of the organization you're in and what your focus is, you may care only about one of these, and yet there are lots of different interactions between each of these dimensions. Everything ultimately becomes a priority, but what's important to a patient might not necessarily be the same as what's important to a device manufacturer or within a particular clinical environment. Each of these actually has different regulatory requirements from different organizations as well, further complicating matters, especially for manufacturers. And within the context of a particular clinic, that may influence significantly the risk assessment that winds up being performed. Additionally, these are not all complementary. Some dimensions can interfere with others. So, for example, it was reported a few weeks ago that someone was conducting surgery using a medical device, running antivirus on it. The antivirus crashed, took down the device with it, and interrupted surgery. Yet this is a security control, whether you agree with the, you know, with whether AV is good or bad or not. That was clearly a case where the security feature had a direct impact potentially, or a very strong potential for impact on the patient's safety. And then the distinctions and the tension between security and privacy, I think is fairly well known. For the work that Penny and I are doing, our focus really is on both safety and security and their intersection. When it comes to real-world vulnerabilities in medical devices, there are a couple challenges with how you would want to score or evaluate them. First of all, it can be kind of difficult to really determine what the safety impact is if you've just had a technical finding. So for example, safety regulations already require certain kinds of defense in depth, air gaps almost, not exactly air gaps, but certain much stronger layers of defense and multiple layers of defense than one might typically be used to within the classic IT environment, including fail-safe operations, right? How many computers in your regular IT networks continue after a crash and continue functioning? And yet that's a feature that's important for many kind of medical devices. Part of this challenge is that the applications themselves might not actually interact with that particular part of the device that interacts with or has some kind of physical impact on the patient. Within traditional IT, arguably I'd say that typically you would prioritize integrity and confidentiality over availability, right? For researchers, the red-headed stepchild is to find a denial of service. Oh, those are lame, right? On the other hand, when it comes to patient safety, availability can be essential. If it's a device that's inside you, like a pacemaker running your heart, you know, you need that device to be available all the time. And as someone somewhere said, and I forget who it was, but you know, you really can't reboot a patient. And this is where some of the wrinkles come into play. And the clinical environment really can vary very widely. You could have, you know, massive providers, you know, world famous that are very large with hundreds of thousands of devices and so on, and then, you know, small rural hospitals with just a very small number of beds. And, you know, there's a saying that if you've seen one thing, you've seen them all, right? And the play on words within the hospital case is, if you've seen one hospital, you've just seen one hospital. I have to remember to breathe sometimes. One of these days I'll remember that on a regular basis. So let's go to a real-world vulnerability that came out last year, and this Hospira Life Care infusion pump. This is used for delivering fluids to patients. Now the technical vulnerability, going back to the 90s, a telnet port was accessible without authentication, running as root. That's 80s era stuff practically, let alone 90s. From a CVSS perspective, right, that's a 10.0. That's the worst. That's the worst it can possibly be. In terms of the actual healthcare impact though, well, it was not necessarily proven, or at least not publicly known, whether or not you could actually change the actual dosage of fluid as delivered. But the thing that was publicly reported was the way that these infusion pumps work, or at least some of them, is there are drug libraries that include safety settings, like what is the minimum amount or the maximum amount of flow, or how much drug can be delivered. And those are just settings. It still relies on some other kind of mistake occurring. And in the case of these, the human actually has to manually confirm if they were to happen to go over some kind of limit or make a human mistake in the first place. So there's a little bit of, not exactly defense in depth there, but if you're only able to modify these drug libraries, then maybe the impact isn't so bad, or the likelihood may be significantly reduced of being able to exploit something. There are also environmental considerations within the context of a particular hospital. The pump might actually be on a separate trusted network. You might think, oh, it's on a separate trusted network so you can protect the devices from the rest of the hospital. But oftentimes we hear that it's exactly the other way around, that the devices could carry malware with them and then infect the rest of the hospital. So they're on a trusted network so that the hospital is protected from the devices. For scoring implications of here, right? If there's a hospital that's doing certain kinds of due diligence, such as appropriate networking, segmentation, firewalling, and so on, even though it's a CVSS 10.0, the ultimate risk may actually be fairly minimal. Now, for this particular case, this was something that led to a safety notice by the FDA, which is not exactly literally a recall, but more or less has the effect of a recall. There were certain pumps that just simply could not be updated and could not be fixed. Oh, another aspect for this particular issue as well in terms of the environment is that this pump has, I think, 3 different kinds of interfaces: Ethernet, wireless, and infrared. So if you were relying, for example, on infrared interfaces to manage your pumps, but this vulnerability is only accessible through the Ethernet or wireless, then you weren't even vulnerable at all because you weren't using that particular interface. So there are all of these different kind of considerations here. Another example, now this is not a regulated medical device, but it's still something that's very important to healthcare providers, was a drug cabinet. This was released a little bit earlier this year. Very important to the hospital. This is where all the drugs and medicine is stored. Very valuable. Some medicines, it was shocking to me to hear, can run on the order of $100,000. And the technical vulnerability in here was there was an extensive use of many different third-party components. And the number that you may have heard was like something like 1,423 vulnerabilities in 7 different third-party components or something along those lines. The actual technical impact of that wasn't necessarily clean or wasn't necessarily clear because there were insufficient details. But on the other hand, one of the potential things that could be done would be to actually open up the drug cabinet doors, and then you have free access to all of these drugs. But if you caused a denial of service, in the case of defense in depth, there were manual overrides where you could just manually use regular physical keys to open up the cabinet. So you couldn't do a denial of service against the cabinet and prevent people from getting at the drugs. In the case of being able to open the drug cabinet doors, well, that certainly seems like something you'd want to prevent. But in many hospital environments, they recognize the importance of protecting these drug cabinets. And so they are in much more physically locked down regions usually. It's not like some person can walk in off the street and then go pick up some drugs straight from the cabinet. In here, it looks like it's a CVSS 10 as assigned by ICS cert, but there's no direct impact to patient safety. There may be some indirect impacts if you make it more difficult for people to get their drugs, so to speak. It's definitely a big concern to a hospital if they're worried about protecting their inventory, unless they're behind the appropriate physically secured environments. So there are these different kinds of complications and wrinkles that are a little bit different than what traditional IT security risk assessment might have to consider. So there's any number of different impacts that could occur with successful exploitation of vulnerability within a clinical setting. So you could have an impact on therapy or diagnosis, actually delivering therapy in the case of an infusion pump, diagnosis. There are a lot of different kinds of devices that might have complete records for the patient that help with actually, like x-rays and so on, actually analyzing what the patient's condition is. Monitoring and alerting, making sure within a hospital environment that all the devices are reporting information appropriately. If an emergency happens, then something might pop up at the nurse's station so that they might be aware that something is going on with a patient or something along those lines. Those monitoring devices aren't necessarily directly attached to the patient, but if you don't hear an alarm when something really bad is going on in a room 100 yards away from you, then that certainly has patient safety implications, perhaps indirectly. One thing that we saw in the Hollywood Presbyterian case, the ransomware hack that occurred recently, was at the very least they had a lot of reduced inefficiency. They had to do a whole lot more manual work. As I mentioned before already, medical devices in some cases can be used as pivot points to then go and attack the rest of the network. Privacy loss is a significant concern. This is maybe at least partially driven by HIPAA compliance. A lot of hospitals that we talked to, the primary concern for the hospital boards was privacy versus security, and whether IT security or patient safety. It was privacy because of HIPAA compliance. Financial loss is certainly another consideration as well, and Inga and Becky did a good job, I think, explaining some of that in their talk yesterday. And then there's less quantifiable things as well, such as reputation damage, or the population-wide loss of faith in devices, which might cause patients to not want to use devices because they're afraid of being hacked. And in the grand scheme of things, you know, you don't want FUD to prevent a patient from using a device that gives them, you know, life-critical treatment. So you note here that many of these, this is a different kind of math, effectively, than you might have in the finance world. And so that was one thing that I really found interesting about Inga and Becky's talk yesterday, was talking about some areas where you might not traditionally have math, where there might be some similar kinds of attributes or something along those lines that would be measurable in some kind of way. And yet you don't want to get, you know, how would you quantify when you need to reboot a patient or you lose a patient or something along those lines. So this is a number of different kind of challenges that are faced. The takeaway from this sort of problem space really is that it seems, more so than in some other industries, that environment really matters. And CVSS as it exists, at least the raw technical scores, there's very clearly no direct relationship between the technical CVSS score and what the actual impact to patient safety is going to be. And yet this is the problem space that we're trying to work with. So then what is it that you want in a good scoring method that might take into account healthcare? So you want certainly minimum complexity. You want it to actually be usable by practitioners. And when I say practitioners, I'm not saying security personnel at the hospital. Many hospitals don't even have their own security personnel. But people who are actually at the hospital who might not be fluent within security. Ideally, we want it to be usable by practitioners. To be able to have consistent, acceptable scoring, we want it to be accepted by a diverse set of stakeholders. Not only manufacturers, hospitals, security researchers, patients, regulators, insurers, any number of other kinds of stakeholders. The ideal method would be flexible for different clinical environments that can vary very widely. And it needs to be flexible for different device classes as well. Something that performs a sonogram has a very different threat model and a very different impact to patient safety as an MRI might, or as an infusion pump might, or a pacemaker. One of the key features of metrics in general is repeatability. You want different people to use the metric and be able to come up with the same score. Ultimately, it needs to be validated. We don't just want to toss something out there. And one feature that I think CVSS provided, which is very useful, but not ultimately about the number itself, is that for metrics like CVSS, at least provided a framework and almost a language for discussing certain pieces of information that would go into the risk assessment. And so even if disagreements would come up, it would still help to focus the discussion on where the disagreements were, and at least try and get people centered around a common language. So these are all the different kind of features for what it is that we would be looking for that could help us with conducting risk assessment for medical devices. And so what we did was we then looked at a few different kinds of frameworks. So one of them that comes from the safety world is hazard analysis. The thing with hazard analysis is it is focused on safety It's a well-established practice, and it's the language and the practice that manufacturers already speak. On the other hand, not a lot of researchers are familiar with that methodology, and hazard analysis in general does not consider the sentient, malicious, active attacker. CVSS version 2, one of the pros, of course, is that it's been very widely adopted and validated, as much as everyone all loves to hate on it. On the other hand, how it handles environmental portions of the CVSS version 2 metric, it doesn't really have much of an impact on the score. CVSS version 3 actually does have a number of emphases on being able to perform appropriate environmental considerations, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in a moment. But one of the cons is it's not yet widely adopted. And as far as we know, we're the most concrete effort that is trying to actually look into CVSS version 3 with respect to systems that have physical impacts, i.e. cyber-physical systems. There, I said it. I don't apologize. A little bit less known metric is called the Common Weakness Scoring System. This one was really, it's associated with CWE, if you're familiar with the Common Weakness Enumeration. It's a little bit more developer focused, but it also brought in brings in certain elements that may be of concern and of use to us. And then also, for those in the finance world especially, there's the FAIR methodology, heavily adopted by finance. I had thought that it was proprietary, but someone reminded me today that about there's an open FAIR, there's an open sourced version of it, basically. So how many people are familiar enough with CVSS to know the temporal and environmental portions? Okay. Let's see the time here. I'll go by here in a moment. So our basic approach really is to try and adapt CVSS and bring it into a healthcare environment, considering things such as what compensating controls may exist within the hospital, considering the negative impact that could occur, and also trying to consider in some ways the kind of threats that occur that are likely to occur or maybe not likely to occur, but the threats that could happen within the healthcare environment. Because of limitations of CVSS 2.0, we are really concentrating on CVSS 3.0. And one of the main benefits for CVSS 3 is not only do they have the confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirement, which is a normal aspect of the environmental score for CVSS version 2, but you can basically specify within the environmental portion certain criteria that would allow you to modify the base score. Within the context of CVSS version 2, the base score was something that could never really be modified. And yet there's a recognition within CVSS 3 that sometimes the environment really actually changes how you interpret this otherwise non-changing base score. There are also some elements from the Common Weakness Scoring System and the Common Weakness Risk Analysis framework that I'm not going to focus on too much at the moment, given some time constraints here. Well, one of the big things out of CWRAF or CRAF is the realization that, for example, with CWE or CVEs as well, if you think about vulnerabilities, or CWE, programmer errors, the technical impacts of these errors, more or less any one you can think of, can be described in this small set of eight different impacts. Modifying data, reading data, causing certain variations of denial of service, being able to execute programs or commands, hiding activities, all that kind of stuff. That's an important realization because what CRAF does is it allows you to provide a context for the business to describe in business terms what these technical impacts what the impact would be on the business. And so, for example, there's this notion of vignettes. It's almost like a scenario. So in this case, it's an example vignette for, let's say, a web-based shopping cart, because we all know the web and we all love to shop, whether we admit it or not, perhaps. The notion being that you take the 8 different technical impacts on the left-hand side, assign a weight based on how important it is to you and your business if a vulnerability is found that has that negative technical impact, along with a business-oriented explanation for why that impact is a particularly bad thing. So one approach that we're looking at is, one of our main approaches is to borrow this notion from CRAF of these vignettes with these kinds of technical impact scorecards, to then go and define new vignettes with new technical impact scorecards for medical devices, and perhaps from different perspectives. So for example, if you care only about physical safety in your particular risk analysis that you're conducting right now, and for the time being you want to ignore the privacy implications, then no matter what data gets read, maybe unless it's credentials, but pretty much reading data you don't care about within the context of doing a physical safety analysis. Now, of course, it's not always necessarily that easy, because if you can read credentials, maybe that can lead to being able to execute code or commands. So there are some complications here, but do people get the sense here of what the scorecard is like and intended to do? To reflect the different prioritizations, and yet to be able to disassociate the business people, the decision makers, from having to know the specific details of cross-site scripting or buffer overflow or whatever. Because all those different kinds of vulnerabilities, they can all be described in terms of these 8 technical impacts. So this is one way that you can really connect the technical people with the business people. So within CWSS, how it utilizes CRAF is, and CWSS is focused on developers, automated code analysis tools. A code analysis tool might run against a certain line of code or something. Wow, squeaky. Find some issues, pipe them into the CWSS scoring engine, which takes as an actual input the vignette's technical impact scorecard, which then accordingly adjusts, which then adjusts the values within the CWSS scoring engine itself, which then generates more business-oriented risk metrics. So we're not using CWSS directly, but we're borrowing the spirit of some of this kind of work. And so the scenario that we anticipate building towards is, let's say you have a vulnerability that gets discovered, it's published, a CVE winds up being assigned, we generate some kind of vector in a CWSS style that also then gets fed any number of, we find the appropriate vignette for the appropriate HDO environment and the type of device, for example, feeds in and makes adjustments to our CWSS score. And that can then be used for filling out the environmental portion of the CVSS version 3 metric. That's kind of the vision of where we're going. There's a bit of work we still need to do in that area. How does this all tie in to the FDA and its guidance? One of the big things in the post-market guidance draft that the FDA put out in, I think it was January, they will be coming out with a final version at a later point. They've received 3 months of comments, and so they're processing those comments. But the basic idea is in part of that guidance to manufacturers is to really assess how exploitable is the vulnerability in the first place. And additionally, how do you directly assess what the severity impact is to health? And there's some kind of continuum that involves also this notion of controlled or uncontrolled risk, more or less touching on elements such as, is the issue even patchable? Do existing controls, either within the environment or within the manufacturer, exist that help to minimize the safety impact. And so we think that the work that we're doing with adapting CVSS, as well as leveraging particular elements of CWSS, this list on the left-hand side is the notion of where different parts of the work that we're touching on can feed into FDA's post-market guidance and how manufacturers can interpret and use it. So we have the 8 different kind of technical impacts, which may have strong associations with the hazards analysis, the more safety-oriented hazards analysis, which then can be used to get some notion of the severity impact to health that the FDA touches on in its document. There are certain elements within CVSS and CWSS that touch on the notion of vulnerability exploitability, as FDA defines it. And then there are certain elements of CWSS itself that really get into controls that may help with minimizing or reducing the risk to what the FDA calls essential clinical performance. There's a number of different challenges, though, that we're going to face in doing this. One of them is that what is the right level of abstraction for device classes? There are many, many different kinds of devices. It's shocking. You don't want to create these vignettes for every single kind of device that's out there. But maybe there are different classes of devices that have certain kinds of functionality. Maybe we can treat things at a little bit higher level, or maybe we have to go almost on a per device. It's not necessarily clear yet. We're still in the beginning stage of this work. There's also the more or less the classic question about what's the right level of abstraction for dealing with vulnerabilities. So, for example, you know, in the drug cabinet example I gave you, there were 1,423 vulnerabilities reported. You don't want to be doing any kind of risk assessment necessarily on each one of those individual vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, there were seven affected components, third-party components, that had those 1,423 vulnerabilities. Another question or another thing that we will be wrestling with is this notion of, can you provide multiple business value contexts, multiple technical scorecards that reflect different prioritizations that there may be for the hospital or for the manufacturer, such as one part, maybe they really care about HIPAA compliance, whereas another part may care primarily about patient safety. How do we manage those different perspectives? You can't combine all those into a single score. That much is very clear. But do we have to create entirely different vignettes for each of these? Maybe. And we will find that out. In the end run, it's not necessarily even clear that the approach that we're taking, it's not necessarily certain that we will be able to influence or feed in appropriate elements of the CVSS version 3 environmental score. Maybe that's still not enough input to give the kinds of results that can be validated and acceptable to all of the different kinds of stakeholders. Maybe, relative to medical devices and patient safety analysis, maybe CVSS version 3 is not necessarily sufficient. We don't know yet. But we have started to talk to FIRST, who owns CVSS, and we will continue to be talking with them. And if we have inputs and insights, we will certainly be letting them know. Another challenge that we really deal with, and I touched a little bit on this already, is the notion of third-party components and this notion of bill of materials. One concern that a lot of healthcare providers have is, let's say the next heartbleed comes around. Oh, heck, let's still use heartbleed because it's still around, right? You hear about heartbleed, and one of the first questions you might ask yourself in a hospital context relative to the security of your devices is, which of my devices even have the vulnerable versions of OpenSSL? It would be really nice if you knew on your device what the bill of materials was, what third-party components there were, what the libraries were, what their versions were, and so on. And yet, medical device manufacturers are generally reluctant to provide that kind of information. And when I say generally reluctant, I mean they really, really, really don't want to do it. Philips is the only company on the medical device side that has publicly said that they're willing to do it. I don't necessarily blame the manufacturers in a sense because, you know, asset management is hard, right? How many boxes do you have even that you have full control over? How many boxes do you have where you really know what all your third-party dependencies are? So there's a challenge there. And the way scoring of third-party libraries happens now is, you know, let's say a CVE comes out for a third-party library. It gets added to NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. A CVSS score winds up getting assigned. But that score is being done in isolation, just looking at the library itself. Depending on where that library is in a particular software package or within a medical device, that library might not even be in use. The affected API function might be around, but it might only be interacting with trusted components or only interacting with components that an attacker simply can't touch or influence. And so in some cases, the CVSS score, at least as it's done now for third-party libraries, may be overinflating the risk. Or in some cases, underinflating, right? When it comes to a denial of service, suddenly that's really important if it's in a device that actually is controlling or otherwise influencing patient's health directly. So there's a good chunk of challenges that come in play with respect to third-party components. We're not doing this on our own, thankfully. I wouldn't like the pressure. And one thing that we do at MITRE in these kinds of efforts, which is very much in tune with how the FDA takes this whole of community approach, is we brought in a pretty diverse set of stakeholders, not exactly a tiger team, but a very small working group with approximately a dozen members. And we just kicked it off a few weeks ago. This is part of our road shows, so to speak, to engage with even more people. But with respect to our working group, we have people from manufacturers, representatives from healthcare providers, some security researchers or consultants, even a patient or two, some academia, and some government agencies, not just FDA, but some other agencies as well that have a lot of interest in this space. With that working group, we're basically working very heavily over this summer especially to work on our first use case, which is to draft a vignette along with a technical impact scorecard to tie together everything for infusion pumps. And we expect to be having something out there on the order of weeks, pretty much. Certainly sometime this summer. Why infusion pumps? They're everywhere. There's a ton of them. There are often very directly patient safety impacts. A lot of past work has been done on infusion pumps. Some of the vulnerabilities that have been discovered are in infusion pumps, and there are actually even safety and hazards analysis models available that deal with infusion pumps. So just due to their ubiquity and the availability of other knowledge there, we believe that that's an important device class to start with. We certainly plan on expanding to other device classes. But working with the individual, this almost tiger team working group, once we have that out there, we will start engaging much more actively and directly with the broader community. Because whatever we come up with respect to this approach, again, I gave you a whole bunch of different criteria for what would make a good metric in this context. And one of the metrics certainly is to be acceptable to all different kinds of stakeholders, and also to be able to validate it. And we need to actively engage with the broader community in order to do that. As a later step as well, this is something that this approach we may be able to submit to the FDA as part of what's called a medical device development tool. Something that can be used, that's reliable enough or useful enough, that can be used to help manufacturers or the FDA itself to make certain kinds of assessments of severity or security relative to the medical device. This is a new concept for them at the FDA. We're the first cybersecurity product, so to speak, that they will be using potentially. It needs to go through the submission process. It's all very early stages, but that is certainly one of the end goals if all of this works out very well.